welcome to Always Take Notes.
Hello listeners, you may remember that a few months ago we made some improvements to our Patreon offering, refreshing our package of successful pitches for people who support Always Take Notes. Since then, we've been so delighted to see more people join up. We've loved hearing from you about how useful you found the package and the podcast, but we're really keen to keep expanding the benefits available to all the people who support us.
So with that in mind, we've added 40 new pages of material to the package, including pitches to the New York Times, the Washington Post and the BBC. This means the whole compendium now runs to a whopping 160 pages. And we're excited to announce that for people who contribute $10 a month, we're also going to start releasing bonus mini episodes. If you'd like to know what these will sound like, there's a sample episode with Lee Child that you can listen to for free on our Patreon now.
Thanks to the help of our sponsor, Scrivener, the first 10 new sign-ups at $10 per month will receive a lifelong license to Scrivener worth £55. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, academic papers, and even scripts. We're now down to 8 of them left, so if you're interested, check it out as soon as you can.
These are just a few of the updates we've made to our Patreon offering. So if you'd like to find out more about how to get your hands on an ATN mug, suggest questions for upcoming guests, or join a monthly call with us to workshop a pitch, head to www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes. That's www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes.
And thanks so much again for all your support so far. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and I speak with the historian Hallie Rubenhold.
We spoke to Hallie about moving from the world of museums to the world of writing, about The Five, her prize-winning book about Jack the Ripper's victims, and about her new book, Story of a Murder.
This episode was organised in conjunction with Hay Festival, and it's a great interview which we hope you enjoy.
Hallie, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Can't we start with your new book, Story of a Murder? Tell us about when you first became aware of this story of Belle Elmore and when you decided that you wanted to write about it.
Well, the first time I became aware of it was actually not the story of Belle Elmore, but the story of Dr. Crippen, who killed her, because that is the way in which it's always been told. You know, we tend to fixate on the murderer's story at the expense of everybody else, you know, and when I say everybody else, it's not just the victim, it's the entire community, it's families, it's society, you know, and the story of a murder becomes, well, a murderer's story, which is a linear story. And I became aware of this story, the Crippen murder, as it's been called, when I was working on The Five, my previous book. And one of the sources that joins both stories together is an autobiography that was written by a man, Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard. And he wrote an autobiography when he retired from Scotland Yard called I Caught Crippen. And he had started his career as a young police officer working on the Ripper case. And so I had come to that particular work through my research for The Five, and went on to read the rest of his book, and was wondering, well, who is this Crippen? And I read the story, and I was just amazed at the different layers of the story. And first of all, you know, again, this has always been told as a sort of very linear story, and people who know it kind of know the headlines about, you know, Dr. Crippen murders his wife, Belle Elmore, who is a music hall performer, and escapes on a ship which was fitted with Marconi wireless, which was this very new technology in 1910, which allowed the captain to wire to Scotland Yard and tell them that he had the fugitives Crippen and his mistress Ethel Leneve on board, and Inspector Dew was able to get a faster ship and catch them as they came into port in Canada. And that's usually what most people know about this. But the story is so multi-layered, and it's a real picture of the world at the turn of the century. And I really wanted to tell that story, not just the murderer's story.
And we saw that this started as a COVID-era project. So what were the complexities of doing your research in a pandemic in terms of, we saw, you know, it's difficult to get into archives and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was a complete nightmare. I mean, it was a complete nightmare. That was a challenge for me and for other people who write nonfiction and, people who are writing their academic works as well, students who are writing theses and dissertations and who just simply couldn't access the sources. And so the problem was, it was just terrible timing because I had signed the contract for this. I think it was just about kind of very end 2019, 2020, at beginning of 2020. And I had drafted out an entire research proposal of where I was going to go, and I was going to go and spend, I think, about 3 weeks in the US, and 2 of those weeks were going to be in New York and looking at all these sources because the Crippens were American, and there's a whole first undertold part of the story that takes place in the United States and Salt Lake City and New York, and I was going to do all my research there, and of course, then lockdown came, and there was just nobody knew when it was going to end. And the National Archives were shut, and then periodically reopened. So I had to do everything out of sequence. And then, of course, when everything opened up again, I found that I had to redo everything. So, it took a phenomenally long period of time, and it started to become very stressful and overburdening because, this is a very complex, very long story, which I was kind of carrying around in my head for a very long time and unable to sort of deposit it on a page at the rate I would have liked.
You mentioned doing things out of sequence. So do you prefer, in general, when you're researching, to start at the beginning and move your way kind of as you would through the book to the end?
With nonfiction, generally you write a very detailed research proposal, and I like to know exactly what there is, so I don't overpromise to anybody what I can or can't deliver, and I think it's a very wise thing to do. Never overpromise. And the thing about a nonfiction proposal is it never ends up exactly the same way that you think it's going to end up. You have this concept of what the book's going to look like, and then when it's actually written, it is actually a completely different thing because the research forms your judgments and forms what exactly you're going to put on the page. I do like to start my research from a point that allows me to have a complete overview of what's available. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that's where I'm going to start writing. But I want to know, I will go and look at the primary source material or have an idea of what's there. Definitely look at all the secondary source material, something that will give me a big overview so I can actually start and with confidence and knowing that I can write this book.
And this approach of looking at victims, and specifically female victims rather than male perpetrators, this is an extension of the way you worked on The Five. What for you was the kind of original interest, or what originally attracted you to taking that approach with these books?
Well, I think usually, one of the things that I've noticed is, oh gosh, there's so many different ways in which I can answer this question. First of all, the female story is often left off the record, but so is the story of, I hate to say it, the majority of people. The majority of people who populated history don't get their stories told at all. And in fact, that's what interests me. I'm not the sort of author who would write a book about a monarch. Or would write a book about somebody very famous, because I'm not going to say I'm not interested in that person's life, but I think that person has had an opportunity to have their stories told over and over again. And I feel I want to say something entirely new most of the time. And there is something really marvelous about discovering or bringing to light an unknown life, or a series of unknown lives. And, I'm interested in the women's side of the story, but more broadly, in literally the majority of people's experiences that formed history, that we just don't have an abundance of books published about. And yet they are the majority from whom we are largely all descendant, and I think restoring their stories to the record is so important, whether they're men or women.
What are the specific sort of, sorry to keep banging on about research, but what are the specific research challenges of that approach? I mean, as you say, you're interested in the stories of people that are not famous, that have not been endlessly written about, who there probably aren't endless records of, or endless kind of contemporaneous documents. I mean, how do you find the sources that you need to tell your story properly?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, is that, I mean, I remember being told very early on when I was studying history as a postgraduate, and granted, this was in the 90s, and things have moved on a bit since then, thank God. Um, but, I was told, oh, well, the reason why, we don't tell the stories of ordinary people because they didn't leave records. They couldn't read and write, and so they didn't leave letters and diaries and all the stuff that we tend to use when we talk about the privileged classes, the aristocracy, but that is just wrong. It's wrong. And one of the things actually that digitization has done, and this massive campaign to digitize primary sources and a lot of secondary sources, has really been going on for the past 25 years or so, means that these little stories are much more accessible in through the digitization of sources, which we didn't really know about or were harder to search. And so it's easier to piece these stories together. So they do exist, and they exist in documents that this kind of very snobbish tradition in history has always just kind of written off, like, workhouse documents, social housing documents, army records of ordinary people, education records. You can piece together people's lives, and then you can overlay a bigger experience. So, for example, we may not know what exactly somebody's life was like in a particular workhouse in 1860. But we know there were other women in that workhouse who left accounts who we can use. So the parts of those accounts will be very useful for filling in the blanks of somebody else's life. And that's how you do it. And yes, it is more complicated. It's not an easy approach. But it's one that I think, for me personally, is infinitely more rewarding than just reaching for another book, which is, has been looked at millions of times before and telling the same life story of a king that lived.
Just on this point about restoring the position of ordinary people in history, which I think is very powerful. How do you sort of square that with the murder piece? Because murder is a minority sport, right? The majority of people are not murderers and are not murdered. So in a sense, although, as you say, it's not a hereditary elite or a political elite, it is also a very narrow section of human experience as well.
Yes, but I mean, the majority of people are not murderers, but the majority of people get their stories told through witness statements and trial transcripts. And what is so amazing, I mean, why I have gravitated towards this is simply because of the amount of documentation that is thrown up in the course of a crime. So, I mean, it is phenomenal, because what you end up with are an entire trove of first-hand accounts of what people saw, a variety of random people in the neighborhood, people who knew the suspect, people who knew the victim, people who knew, what they were doing on an average day in their lives, what they were wearing, what they were eating, what sort of jobs they had, what they thought about the world, what they thought about people. And nowhere else do we get such a broad range of insights into the lives of ordinary people in their own words. And that, to me, is, I was drawn to tell this story because of that, because of what these sources can offer us as a social historian. I mean, how incredibly valuable these resources are.
How do you organize your material once you've collected everything? And I'm talking the real specifics of, do you use note cards? Do you use Google Documents? I mean, how do you, once you've amassed all of that material? I was amazed by reading your book and the kind of huge cast of characters that you had to keep track of. How do you keep all of that kind of square in your mind?
Oh God, it's so hard. I mean, I do lots and lots of documents. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say, and I'm going to hold this up, I do really like the spiral bound notebook. And will take notes on that, and then I will put it in various documents. I will, I'll take notes on that and compile them. And then one thing that I do for everything, and it was really hard with this with the Story of a Murder, because I had obviously Crippen, Ethel, and Belle, and then the Musical Ladies Guild, and I created massive timelines of where everybody was at any given time. And so trying to marry up, if she was there at that time, that's very interesting, because she obviously knew. So that's kind of my masterpiece. The other thing is, with this particular case, and also it's different for every book you write, because the material you're using is different every single time, and the story is different every single time. So just when you think you've cracked a system, you have to start all over again with the next book. So what I did with this book in particular was trying to figure out where people were at various times. I actually printed out a calendar from 1910 and plotted all of the important things that happened on each month by month. And that did help, because that gave me a really good overview of this.
We wanted to come back to the new book in due course, but could we roll back now to your early life? And I suppose there is a bit of an overlay here in that, in the book, Crippen moves from the US to London, but you also have this kind of Anglo-American background. So you grew up in LA, but then you studied as a graduate student in Leeds. Could you take us back to your early life and, your interest in books and reading and writing and history, and where that all came from?
I mean, so my dad is English, and my grandfather moved the family over to Los Angeles in the 1950s, where he worked for the film studios, cutting hair. And as family legend has it, he was Steve McQueen's hairdresser. So that's my family's claim to fame, however minor. But along with my grandparents and my father came a lot of family history and stories about the Second World War. And my father lived through the Second World War, and as did my grandfather, and he was evacuated to Northampton. And so I grew up being told about Blitz and was absolutely captivated by these stories. And as it is with a lot of people, I think that Second World War is a sort of historical gateway drug to other forms of history. And so I became very interested in the Second World War. And I also, because I grew up in, the West Coast, and I grew up in the Wild West, as they said, I became very interested in frontier history and Western history. And we used to go to ghost towns on holiday when I was a child, and that just blew my mind. And the old gold mining in Northern California, the gold mining towns and the centers, and spend a lot of time reading books like Little House on the Prairie, and that I just naturally gravitated to the past and all the questions that I wanted to ask. And I think, what I was doing is I was evolving, I think, as a social historian, even very young, because the questions I was asking were more about everyday life. And how did people survive? What was life like? And what were the challenges of being alive in these times and places? But it really wasn't until I became an undergraduate that in one class that I was taking, I was told to read Lawrence Stone's The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, which suddenly it was like this great epiphany, this light bulb moment when I realized, oh my God, social history, it's a real thing. And this is really what I want to do. This is my calling. So that really helped to form me.
Is that a distinction that historians still use, the kind of social history versus just history? I mean, does it kind of denote a bottom-up versus top-down approach?
Yeah, it totally does. And I'm quite resentful of it, actually, in the same way that I get very annoyed about labels that are applied to history. First of all, I'm an enormous opponent of what I would call great man history. Great man history is, traditionally what we have been told is history, and a lot of people have been completely inculcated in this idea that history is the great deeds of great men, and everybody else, is of no consequence whatsoever. but this labels, there's women's history and there's this history and there's that history. No, it's all history, because what that labeling does seems to other everybody else's history. I mean, one can understand, the description of there's economic history and political history and social history, but it is all history. And it's all due a certain amount of respect. At the moment, it's sort of like political and military history is like the only real history. And that's great man history. And that, we really, really need to rethink why we are defining history in these very 19th century terms that are no longer applicable, and I think actively put people off studying history.
And when you came to the UK as a graduate student and to study, what was your experience of living and studying here and actually being in Britain like, compared to these stories that you'd absorbed from your family as a child?
Well, it was, I think it has a lot to do with where I was as a person. I was in my early 20s and, footloose and fancy free, but, well, not exactly. Tied to a course and coursework and a degree. But the idea of living, on my own and being able to make my own way was so thrilling that it didn't matter that I was living in Leeds in the 90s, in Headingley, which was quite down at heel, and having a fantastic time. I really was under no illusions of what Britain was like. I had travelled here and been here and visited family here quite a few times before I came to live here. So it wasn't, there was nothing, there were no surprises. But at the same time, there were a lot of things I had to learn. It's the old, what is it? One culture separated by two different languages. And I'm completely misquoting that. But it is, the class system is very alive still in this country. It's gradually being deconstructed, but I think, even several decades ago, it was, there were things I didn't understand, and, I put my foot in it. And so it's, there was a lot to learn. I've now lived here longer than I lived in the United States. So this feels more like home to me than the US. Though when I go to the US, there are times when there's certain things that feel very cozy and comfortable.
And you did a year studying creative writing and history. What did you learn from that experience, and how did those two sort of writing forms marry on that course?
Oh, I think I was onto something very early. I think I couldn't articulate what it was that seemed to stick those two forms together so well. And actually, the other thing that I was studying was film, and what I wanted to study, but I don't think could articulate it very well, was storytelling. That's what it is, how do we tell stories? Why do we tell stories? Truth versus fiction. What is fictionalized? Where are the boundaries between the two? How do we present this? Story is such an incredibly powerful thing in most people's lives. We don't realize in our culture, in society, everything is narrativized. We narrativize our own lives. And amongst all of that, you want to ask, well, where is truth? Where does truth lie? Whose truth? Whose story is truth? And I think that was the question that was always captivating to me.
Could you tell us about your early professional steps? So you worked as an assistant curator at the National Portrait Gallery. Did you ever consider a kind of academic career in history? Well, we've had interesting conversations on the show about the kind of sometimes mutually vexed relationships between academic and quote unquote popular historians. Was that ever a way that you thought you would go?
Yes. In fact, I started a PhD and something terrible happened, which was today it would be considered negligence. And my supervisor, I signed up for a PhD. My supervisor disappeared for a year. And I was left with somebody else in another department, and I wasn't supervised. And then and through some technicality, because I wanted an element of art history in my PhD, and had written an entirely art history paper to be submitted for my upgrade in the history department, and the people who are my upgrade committee were all military historians, and decided that I couldn't be upgraded because I was writing a history PhD in the history department, and I would have to deregister from the department and go and register in the art history department, and I couldn't afford to do that. So I did an MPhil. So I have an MA in British history and an MPhil in British history as well because of that. I don't believe that would happen today, but as I said, in the 90s, it was a very different experience.
And so what was the experience of being a curator like?
It was a very educative process in my life. I had, prior to that, worked in commercial art as a researcher to Philip Mould, who is I believe he's on Fake or Fortune now, but I researched his portraits, and my expertise was in British portraiture, and then I became an assistant curator at the National Portrait Gallery. It wasn't a brilliant experience. I felt bullied, and in many cases this was, not a bad thing that I had negative experiences that sort of pushed me in the direction of where I really wanted to go rather than where I thought I wanted to be. And where I thought I wanted to be was definitely the wrong place for me.
Could we turn now to your first book, The Covent Garden Ladies, published in 2005? So this was a history of Harris's List, this famous, notorious 18th century directory of prostitutes or of sex workers. And we always like speaking to authors of all stripes about their first publication, of how it came about, so how the mechanics of a proposal, an agent, an editor and a publisher kind of came together. So could you take us back to that time and tell us about the origin of this book?
The interesting thing about this book is that it had neither an agent nor a proposal. This book came about with a very small publishing house, which is no longer with us. It has been absorbed by the History Press. And the publisher at the time was somebody I met at a wedding that I was sitting next to. And he said, well, you're an 18th century historian. Have you heard of the Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies? And I said, yes, I have. Why? And he said, well, do you think there's a book in it? I thought, I don't know. Well, I'll go away and research it and find out. And I went away and I looked up various things, and I kind of wrote about like 2 sides of A4 saying, yeah, I think this would work. And then next thing I know, I've got this contract in the post, which I signed. I had no advance. I had no agent. I realize now that was, with hindsight, that was completely the wrong thing to do. But I had no guidance either. Nobody, I didn't know anybody who was an author. The only people I knew who were authors were academics, and academics were just supposed to write books as part of what they did. And so that was what I thought I would do. And it was really after the fact. I mean, that was, I think, one of the worst mistakes I made. And I didn't know any better.
Rarely have conversations at weddings been so productive, though.
No, it was ultimately it ended up, that the result was very good. I got, I had no advance. I worked for free. I wrote that book for free, and everything that
How did you make it work? How did you support yourself during that time?
I was teaching at the time. So I was teaching American students on study abroad. And so I was doing that. I would say I was teaching 3 courses, and then I would come home and I would write. And that's what I did. That's how I made it work. And it was difficult, but I really, really loved what I was writing. And I really do wish somebody would have just grabbed me and shaken me and said, you should get an agent. You should do this, that, the other. And then I remember, when I finally did get an agent and I was told what I should have done, and I just felt like such an idiot for having made those mistakes, and kind of resentful that I didn't have anybody I could have turned to and asked questions.
Just to really get into the kind of nitty gritty, which we love. I mean, did you have a royalty stake, or, and when it was adapted, how did that work? I mean, what was the contract that you signed?
Well, the contract I signed was just I would get paid when the book sold. That was it. And so, I mean, so as it then turned out, I've had these, I think well, I wouldn't say any writer's life, but a lot of people's lives are, a series of kind of misfortunes and fortunes. And this was one of the good things that happened was, in fact, when Tempest, the publisher, went bust, then the contracts were null and void, which meant that by then I was with Penguin Random House, and I said, would you like this book? And they said, yes, please. And then my agent sorted that out, and we had another contract. And so that was very useful. That was, a nice stroke of luck for me. And that was obviously the Come Garden Ladies later became the inspiration for Harlots, the TV series. And again, that had started out as an issue where the book was used without my permission initially. And there was a battle. And thank God I was with Penguin Random House, and their legal department was able to take it on. And then everything really just turned around. And in fact, amends were made, and we worked together very well on the next couple of series.
At what point did you get an agent then? Was it after Covent Garden Ladies and then before you wrote your next book?
Yes, it was after Covent Garden Ladies, when I had learned that I had made a series of very careless errors about how I should proceed in my career. And I got an agent, and then I submitted a proposal for my next book, which was called Lady Worsley's Whim, which would later become the scandalous Lady W for the BBC.
Before we move on, just on Covent Garden Ladies, I mean, what were your research sources and things for that? And just a kind of very, very kind of pragmatic and biological question, but in the 18th century, in an age before reliable contraception, how did sex work in terms of, were these women getting constantly pregnant? Were they having backstreet abortions? Like, were you able to get into that stuff as you were?
Well, that's, what, that is a question I ask all the time, and it is one of these fascinating things about women's lives. So a lot of what was written about these sex workers' lives, and the Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies is, they were guidebooks to sex workers in the 18th century. But what I found so fascinating about them was, these books is that basically they are short paragraphs of ordinary women, which gives descriptions about who they were and what they looked like and what their life stories were. And to me, that was really amazing. But this was all written by men, and in part by a man called Samuel Derrick, who was a failed poet. And so these women's stories, because they are so... These women were believed to have existed for male pleasure. Women were believed to exist for male pleasure and to serve men. So pregnancy did not enter into the equation. It was a woman's problem. If a woman got pregnant, it was her issue. She had to deal with it. What a man did, what he thought, he was just there to use her for his pleasure. And so, the women, to their credit, often got what they wanted from that relationship too. And sometimes, love blossomed from those relationships. Sometimes a woman was able to make just a really good income off the back of that, and she squirreled money away, and she bought houses, and was able to really succeed. And I found that fascinating. But things like the issues of pregnancy and abortion, yeah, we have to imagine that happened all the time. We know that there were all sorts of abortifacients that were used by women. Some were available, you could buy them. Hooper's female pills in the newspaper, you could order them. And these were basically low-level poisons that women would take and quite often died from taking. And then there were abortions that were done, and women died from abortions. there were other ways in which women could prevent contraception, or, I mean, we didn't even really understand how contraception worked at that time either. And so often women had a lot of children. There was a very high infant mortality rate. So just because you had children didn't mean they were going to survive. Their children were abandoned. It's a very different landscape. It was a very different society. And to me, that's what makes the 18th century in those particular circumstances in those women's lives and in people's lives so utterly fascinating, because they were us, but they weren't us.
And kind of remaining in the 18th century, I mean, when you moved on to write novels, was that because you'd amassed so much material that the stories kind of came naturally to you? Tell us about the decision to move between fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah, that absolutely. I mean, Mistress of My Fate and The French Lesson are two novels that I wrote. I was intending to write a third, but then my publisher really wanted me to get back to writing nonfiction, so I kind of parked the third one temporarily. I mean, or permanently, I don't know. Who knows? But yes, I mean, it really comes out of, in fact, the last question that we were just discussing, which is, there's so much male description of, sex workers and women's lives and fallen women. I'll call them fallen women because that's what they were known as at the time. So any woman who had sex outside of marriage was considered a fallen woman, no matter what the circumstances. And there's so much male noise around the fallen woman. And there was a genre of writing called whores memoirs. And I mean, these are fantastic stories, more often than not ghost written by men, about women's exploits working in the sex trade or being a man's mistress. And I thought, well, hang on, why don't I write a book which is actually told from the female perspective, being very honest, within that sort of idiom, as an homage to 18th century and early 19th century writing, which is told entirely from the female perspective, that talks about things about finding oneself pregnant, trying to get rid of the baby, trying to get rid of the pregnancy, trying to deal with, how women felt about their bodies, the terrible shame that women would have felt when they had sex outside of marriage, and the other experiences and the very complex relationships that none of these authors really speak to, but exists nonetheless, kind of submerged in the historical record. And so that was a very good thing, I felt, to fictionalize, to sort of add to the greater narrative.
And what was your process with fiction compared to the non-fiction books? We often, with novelists, have interesting discussions about whether or to what extent they plan their plots in advance. So whether they're a plotter, using the vernacular we've kind of appropriated, or a plunger, whether they just jump in and follow their nose. What was your process writing the novels?
I am a plotter, definitely. And I think one of the most gratifying bits of writing fiction that I enjoy is that moment when I call it just hatching a plot, and it can be days or weeks, and you're going through each step in your head and you're coming up with, well, what happens next? Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And I remember I was actually, for the French lesson, when I was writing the French lesson, I was in Venice for this period, and my husband was able to join me a bit later, and I was there for a couple of days by myself, and I literally just spent like 3 days pacing all of Venice, hatching this story, and then going back and just writing it in a sort of treatment document, where it was kind of pages and pages and pages of, this is what happens, this is what happens. And that's how I do my fiction. And of course, things change along the way, because you'll get halfway through and you think, well, hang on, it makes more sense for her to do this rather than that. It makes more sense for this to happen rather than that. So, but definitely I'm a plotter.
And how do you find the actual experience of putting words on the page, writing in those two different forms?
It's quite like when I was at school, I learned how to play tennis, and obviously, what a tennis swing was and how to hold the racket. And then when I was older, I learned how to play squash, and I had to completely unlearn my tennis swing. I had to learn to hold the racket, and it was a different type of racket in a totally different way, and it felt in a different way. And so I said it's quite like unlearning my tennis swing. I mean, you have to. There are just certain sets of rules that apply to one type of writing that don't apply to the other type of writing, and it's just about clicking it in place in your head. And I appreciate some people can do it and some people can't do it, and some people don't want to do it, and some people don't want to write fiction and some people don't want to write nonfiction, and that's just how we're all made.
Could we turn now to The Five, your biography of the victims of Jack the Ripper? Huge success. It won the Baillie Gifford Prize. Could you again take us back to the origin of this idea, where it came from, and then how you started moving forward with that project?
Well, interestingly, I think this was it was after I'd written the French lesson, and I was thinking back to the Covent Garden Ladies and thinking, that it had become such a kind of cult sensation that I was thinking, well, I'd really like to do something similar to that again. And my first instinct was, well, why don't I do what I did for the Covent Garden Ladies for 19th century sex workers? And my first instinct was, okay, well, who are the most famous 19th century sex workers? And my first thought was, oh, well, that will be the victims of Jack the Ripper. And then I went and I started researching them, and I thought, hang on a second. This doesn't check out. These women don't sound, all of the markers that are usually there when you look at sex workers' lives in the past just weren't there. And the other thing that I found so fascinating was I was really shocked that no one had bothered to write a full-length book which was just about the victims' lives, with nothing to do with him. I couldn't believe it. I mean, the amount of books have been written about Jack the Ripper. And, occasionally people will write about the victims, but they'll only write about the victims in the context of, using the victims as stepping stones to figure out who Jack the Ripper was, or some other suspect theory or something like that. Nobody just considered them as people, and contextualize their lives within the 19th century, within the lives of other people, other women, and what this said about life in the 19th century as a poor woman. And it said a lot. And really, there's so much that we know about these women, and we know absolutely nothing about him. Absolutely nothing. And, it just seemed almost a no-brainer to tell this story.
There's been a move within the genre of true crime, which I know you're not a big fan of that term, but to focus on the victims rather than the perpetrators. Was that something that you were conscious of when you started working on the book, or do you think it's something that took shape and your book was kind of part of that movement?
I think it took shape and the book was part of that movement. Things sometimes all happen at the same time and we don't really know why. It's kind of like birds migrating. There's just a time for something, and everything sort of takes flight at the same time. And I think that's what happened with this. And I do think The Five has influenced a lot of the way in which true crime is told now. And I've been told over and over again by people that The Five has influenced the way they have done their podcasts, the way they have written their books. And it's a massive honor. And it is also a kind of weight to carry as well, that this is what I did, and it's huge. It feels really big.
And what was the significance of the Baillie Gifford Prize win for you? What was that like as an experience? And then how did it kind of impact the trajectory of the book subsequently?
Well, first of all, I was not at all expecting to win. And it really came as a complete surprise. But it really solidified, I think, everything I had done in my career up to that moment. Maybe more so than for other people, because I really have always felt on the fringes, after my experience in academia and really having to live by my wits and really working. Everything I've done has been, I came here as, I didn't grow up in the system here. Everything, I'm a self-made person entirely. And also having the type of history that I do taken seriously. And it's still, it's still a fight. I'm constantly fighting against great man history. But suddenly it was this, it was like, it was being acknowledged. It was all of that work being acknowledged, which really, I mean, made a massive difference in my own psychology. But unfortunately, off the back of that, I mean, I was 2020 was supposed to be an incredible year for me of like traveling all over the world and going to literary festivals. I mean, I was able to do some international travel in that small window before everything shut down, but it was incredibly depressing to see how, I mean, the week we went into lockdown, I was supposed to be in Helsinki. And I was supposed to go to the Hay Festival in Colombia, and I was supposed to have a Spanish book tour, and I mean, there were just so many things that I missed out on that it's for me, I don't know if I'll ever be able to make that up. And it's really been a shame, and it's really been very sad for me, but it was sad for a lot of people.
It's a rule of the show that we always ask about money, and you sort of touched on it in that answer, but how did winning the prize change things for you financially? And, how did it shape your writing career going forward?
I'm going to be completely honest, that it's always a struggle as an author, because you just, what you get paid just doesn't correspond to any rubric at all. It's the fluctuations of the publishing market. And so this idea that like, oh well, you've had a bestseller. I mean, The Story of a Murder is my second bestseller. I'm thrilled to say, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get paid more for my books. And that's the thing that's really unnerving. And you're constantly scrabbling around and thinking about, well, how can I diversify? What else can I do that is going to ensure an income? I mean, it does get easier. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say that I'm in the same position I was when I started out in 2005. I am in a different position, and I'm extremely fortunate. But that concern never completely goes away, because it's not like at a certain point, you get a salary and then that salary will go up. You just don't know what's going to happen.
Can you tell us also about this kind of extraordinary reaction that you got from these sort of so-called ripperologists? So these trolls basically who came after you. Tell us about that, because it sounds bizarre, but also what was their shtick, and how did you go about kind of dealing with it, or choosing just to ignore it?
Well, it was. I mean, I was expecting a little bit of pushback, because the five really did kind of question the standard narrative, and I think, I wasn't expecting as much as I got, and I wasn't expecting like the level of vitriol. I mean, the trolling went on for about 6 years, and I think it is about much more than, I mean, it's, to be honest, it's not about the victims at all. It's about the individual personalities of these people involved, and it's about information hoarding and people who genuinely do not understand what academic scholarship is. People who do not understand that history is not a series of facts. That history is not solving a crime. History is about argument, and it's about creating an argument. And if you don't understand that, it's really hard for people to understand why you select your sources, why you tell your story the way you do. And there's no point in even trying to explain it. I've tried to explain it over and over again. If you don't get it, you don't get it. But it becomes about these people. Most of them were men who have nothing else going on in their lives. The main point of their lives is Jack the Ripper. And I mean, think about that. That's a serial killer at the center of your being. And you are so fascinated with that and your research into Jack the Ripper that, you spend decades of your life trying to figure out who he was. And then this woman comes along and says, well, actually, have you ever thought that maybe you're wrong about this? And that was like, it was an attack on their egos. It was an attack on their personalities. And for them, it was so important that this was a truth, and that truth was disrupted.
So you think kind of underneath it all is that, I don't know, that embarrassment of being disabused of a certain notion or of a preconception? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's embarrassment. It's that's what it is, really. It's embarrassment, but also when you suddenly tell somebody that what they thought was true isn't true. And we get that all the time. And we get that with, the statues being pulled down. What do you mean these people aren't heroes? Well, what do you mean? Well, that's not because people connect with certain narratives that are more than just narratives. They give meaning to people's lives. They give meaning to people's existences. And when you pull that away, people are very upset because you're pulling truth away from them. And if you don't have truth, what do you have?
Is there, though, a risk with, as you say, issues like pulling down statues, but also some of the work in the vein that you've done of trying to particularly take a feminist slant on these things, of applying the values and judgments of the present to the past, of a kind of retrospective imposition, and of starting with an argument and finding evidence to follow that rather than the inverse?
Yeah, well, I mean, that there's always a danger of falling into that, and that's something I'm very, very aware of when I take on any of this, which is, I mean, I completely remove my modern way of thinking and I immerse myself entirely in the era's way of thinking. And never pass judgment. One of the frustrating things, for example, about Story of a Murder is, constantly coming up against, men who you think were heroic in some ways because they did things like they tried to call out fraud, or they stood up to, they were crusading journalists, and then you find out they were eugenicists and anti-Semites and, misogynists and, you realize, the times that I have to use the term, he was a man of his time, because people are what they are. And we have concepts of what we think is acceptable and isn't acceptable anymore. And you just have to shut that off. That's just got to be a switch. You just have to look at people who they were. Yes, it's disappointing that people are like that, but that's what it was like. And in fact, we have to embrace that. And I think one of the things that annoys me a lot about television, and that's a whole other thing, television and film, is that we try to make these people so likable and we completely erase the realities of the past, which were so ugly. I mean, so ugly. I don't think we even depict on screen just how racist and misogynistic and homophobic and anti-Semitic people were. Because I think if we did, they'd be totally unlikable characters. But I think when you're writing stuff like I am, you just have to lay it all out. And that is what it was like.
That leads me on to a question I wanted to ask you, actually, which is about your work as a historical consultant for film and television. Does that involve then telling screenwriters that they need to be blunter and more honest about their depictions of eras, or what do you do exactly as a consultant?
Well, it's a constant negotiation between truth and what works in the medium of film. And that is really, film is a totally different medium from a book. And a drama series, or a feature film is a completely different thing from a documentary. And so you can't apply the same set of rules. And so the objective is always, and I'm always aware when I work on these things, I feel very ashamed of myself. Not ashamed of myself, but I catch myself because I feel very school marmy, kind of wagging my finger, going, well, you know what, that really wouldn't have happened. And that's kind of, there's no way that would have happened. And I'm going to draw the line there. But that's what I'm paid to do, because if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be doing my job. But what I do in the course of historical consultancy is to say, well, you know what, that might not be right, but here are three better options. This would also work. This would also move the plot forward, but also be historically correct. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, what I also say is, I'm giving you everything. I'm giving you all of my stuff, and you take what you want, because film and television is a collaborative experience. And I mean, I am one voice. There's the director's voice. There's the screenwriter's voice. There are many producers' voices. There's the editor's voice. There's the network's voice. There's everybody collaborates. And my voice is one voice. So, I lay down the line. I say, take what you want. And then I step back, because that's all I can do.
Well, look, Hallie, we're coming up against the end of our time. So thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, and wishing you all the best with the new book and with all your other projects going forward.
Thank you very much.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Hallie Rubenhold. She's on Twitter at Hallie Rubenhold and Instagram at Hallie Rubenhold. Her website is hallierubenhold.com, and Story of a Murder is published by Doubleday. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Hallie?
I think the thing that really stuck in my mind with the ripperologists, I believe that is the technical term, and their kind of extraordinary attachment to a particular narrative about this case, and the kind of level of feeling or even vitriol that Hallie had to contend with when she crossed that, which is bizarre and clearly a sort of stressful situation, but it's almost, I suppose it's like a weird kind of almost fandom or a kind of subculture that you step into. Reminds me ever so slightly, but a different context, of the loyal James Bond enthusiasts who came to our event with Nicholas Shakespeare. But I thought it was a very interesting interview, and I think we also got into some good material on the kind of relationship between academic and quote-unquote popular or narrative history, which is a rich vein for us on the podcast. Anyway, what about you?
Agreed. It was odd and fascinating how discomforted people are by, her assertion that lots of these women weren't prostitutes. And I agree with you. I think Hallie was fascinating on her career as a kind of retort to the great man view of history. I always like hearing about people's approach to their research, and in her case, how she found sources that pertained to non-famous people. And also, I thought she was really interesting on the specifics of leading an agent in your early career and how that can prevent you from making missteps and kind of unfavourable business decisions. So I thought it was a very well-rounded and engaging interview. And also the problem of signing a contract for a book where you don't get paid as well, which she was admirably candid about. Agreed, very much so. Simon, what have you been up to? I have been working on a magazine piece, which has been good, doing a lot of kind of reading research, really, which is not always the way I would go into something, but a lot of reading through various foreign language newspaper articles and stuff like that, and digging up leads. I was away in the Lake District the weekend. I went rock climbing and got deeply sunburned, which was just a sort of impossible thing to imagine, the Lake District, from my memories of it being drenched in rain as a child. And then in Matters Culture, I did my usual thing of reading a couple of big magazine pieces. So I read the big investigation that the New York Times magazine did on whether Benjamin Netanyahu has prolonged the war in Gaza to further his own political survival, which is partly done by Patrick Kingsley, who we've had on the podcast many moons ago. But it's a kind of very impressive example of what the New York Times does, which is classically just to throw a huge amount of kind of repertorial horsepower at a big issue. So 3 bylines, 6 months work, 100 interviews. I actually listened to it on audio while in the car, but I do recommend that. It's understandably got a lot of interest. And then a very different piece that I read was Sam Knight's reportage on Wimbledon, which is in the New Yorker, which, I mean, Sam is just the kind of past master at doing that, also a past Always Take Notes guest, but to kind of take a British institution and then
completely dissect it. The piece is often very funny, but also kind of warm, and yeah, he's just a real pro. So I commend that to anyone. Anyway, what about you, Rachel? What have you been up to, and what have you been consuming?
Yes, I also read that Wimbledon piece as something of a local and very much enjoyed it. And speaking of the New York Times, I don't know if I already mentioned this, but there's a great kind of data video about Amy Coney Barrett and her sort of leftward swing in the Supreme Court. So I would also advise people looking at that if they're interested in such topics. Other than that, I have been reading. I don't think I can talk about which books are submitted. I think that's probably a secret, but I promise I am reading them. I just can't talk about them in any depth. But the good weather has been perfect for that because I've just been parked outside in a deck chair with my dog and a stack of books. So my weekends are looking a little bit quieter, but it's been enjoyable. It's been good.
This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Aker.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.